It all started the day I opened my door and found a notice taped to it. Not just any notice, but a fine, a $5,000 fine for so-called illegal hunting. I remember staring at that piece of paper and laughing, not because it was funny, but because I knew what it meant. That little slip of paper wasn't just another HOA citation. It was the spark that set off a chain reaction no one in the neighborhood was ready for. They thought they had the power to control every blade of grass, every driveway, and every mailbox in Green Valley Estates. But what they didn't realize was that there's one thing they couldn't control: property law. And once I started digging, I uncovered a secret that would flip their perfect little world upside down. 2 years earlier, I never imagined myself as the villain of a suburban soap opera. Back then, I was simply looking for peace. After 8 long years in the military, and 5 more crammed into fluorescent lit tech offices in Seattle, I wanted space, silence, somewhere I could breathe without the city pressing down on me. My name is Mason Holloway. I'm 38 years old, and I work remotely as a software engineer for a cybersecurity firm. The job pays well, and better yet, it gave me the freedom to pack up my life and move into the suburbs of Western Washington. Green Valley Estates looked perfect on paper. Big modern homes, manicured lawns, and a backdrop of untouched forests stretching for miles. It was just remote enough to feel peaceful, but still close enough to civilization that I wasn't cut off. Sure, the HOA fees were steep, $450 every quarter, but the realtor brushed it off as the cost of beauty. You'll have award-winning landscaping, community trails, and peace of mind, she'd said. What she didn't mention was the one factor that would define everything that followed. Evelyn Richardson. Evelyn was the HOA president, and she wasn't just any neighborhood busybody. She was a polished, sharp-witted attorney, with a smile as fake as the flowers in her pristine front yard. With her designer outfits and her picture-perfect bob haircut, she looked every bit the part of a leader. But beneath the surface, Evelyn was a control freak of the highest order. She'd been president for 5 years, always running unopposed, and by the time I moved in, the HOA wasn't so much a committee as it was Evelyn's personal kingdom. My first real encounter with her came in the form of a welcome basket. At first glance, it looked thoughtful: cookies, brochures, and some glossy pamphlets. But when I dug deeper, I realized the basket had more bylaws than baked goods. Evelyn didn't just welcome me to Green Valley Estates. She handed me a manual for obedience. For the first few months, I kept my head down. I paid my dues, trimmed my lawn exactly to code, and avoided the dreaded monthly HOA meetings that everyone whispered about. From what my neighbor, Sarah, told me, one of the few genuinely kind people in the neighborhood, those meetings weren't meetings at all. They were trials, where Evelyn sat as judge, jury, and executioner. I might have slipped under Evelyn's radar indefinitely, if not for one thing: my weekend hobby. I grew up in Montana, where hunting wasn't just a pastime. It was a tradition, something passed down from my grandfather to me. It wasn't about trophies or bragging rights. It was about patience, discipline, and connection to the land. After moving to Green Valley, I discovered a stretch of forest just outside the neighborhood, 80 acres of untouched land, with a clear stream and wild deer tracks crossing through the underbrush. To me, it looked like paradise. Curious about who owned it, I checked county records and found the deed belonged to an 83-year-old man named Frank Williams. He'd moved to Florida years earlier but never sold the land. I reached out to him, politely asking if I could hunt there. To my surprise, he responded almost immediately. "Son, I've owned that land for 50 years, he wrote. "If you want to use it, go ahead. Just treat it with respect, and send me a picture if you ever get a buck." So, with Frank's blessing, I began hunting there during the season. It felt right. Quiet mornings in the woods, rifle in hand, waiting as the sun filtered through the trees. But what I didn't know was that Evelyn and her inner circle had other ideas about that land. For years, the HOA had been using Frank's property as if it belonged to them. They carved trails, built benches, and even installed bird feeders. Every morning, Evelyn led groups of residents on exclusive Green Valley wellness walks through those woods. She marketed the trails as part of the HOA's amenities, never mentioning that the land wasn't theirs. That detail would soon become the foundation of everything that followed. One crisp November morning, I was deep in the woods at dawn, crouched in a clearing Frank had told me about. The air was sharp, my breath hanging in the cold. Around 9, I spotted movement in 8-point buck, stepping cautiously into the clearing. I took the shot cleanly. As I approached to dress the deer, I heard voices, and out of the trees came Evelyn and her entourage, dressed in designer athleisure, sipping bottled water and gossiping loudly. The moment Evelyn saw me, her face twisted in horror. To her, it wasn't a hunter on private land. It was a criminal desecrating her imaginary kingdom. She whipped out her phone, snapping photos and muttering about Green Valley's commitment to environmental stewardship. 3 days later, the fine appeared on my door. $5,000 for cruel hunting activities and community disturbance. That's when I realized this wasn't about the deer. It wasn't even about me. It was about control. Evelyn wasn't going to stop until she made me bend the knee. But what she didn't know was that I had already started collecting everything I needed to turn the tables. And by the time I was finished, it wouldn't be me in trouble. It would be her. Before we dive back in, don't forget to like this video and subscribe, because this HOA nightmare is only just getting started. And trust me, the next twist will blow your mind. The notice on my door wasn't just a piece of paper. It was Evelyn Richardson's declaration of war. $5,000, due within 30 days, for an offense committed outside the HOA's jurisdiction. At first, I thought it had to be some kind of mistake. Surely even Evelyn knew she couldn't find me for something that happened on private property. Property I had explicit permission to use. But no, this was no mistake. This was strategy. Evelyn's power didn't come from rules or bylaws alone. It came from fear, from convincing everyone in Green Valley Estates that resistance was pointless. Most people bent under the weight of her threats, paying fines they didn't owe just to avoid the humiliation of being dragged through an HOA meeting. But I wasn't built that way. My years in the military and in cybersecurity had taught me a simple lesson. Bullies thrive on silence, and the only way to stop them is to shine a light on the truth. The first thing I did was gather evidence. I printed out my hunting license, Frank Williams' email granting me permission, and a copy of the county land records showing that the 80 acres of woodland were his, not the HOA's. Then I pulled up the HOA bylaws and combed through them line by line. As expected, there was nothing giving Evelyn or the board authority to regulate activities on land outside the neighborhood's boundaries. Armed with documentation, I was ready for their next move. It came sooner than I expected. The monthly HOA meeting. That evening, I walked into the community center and immediately felt the tension. The room was packed. Evelyn sat at the head of the table like a queen on her throne, flanked by Marcus Bennett, her vice president and loyal yes-man, and Richard Cooper, the treasurer, who looked more nervous than loyal. Around the room, I saw familiar faces, neighbors whispering, glancing at me, and then quickly looking away. Evelyn wasted no time. She opened the meeting with a speech about community, values, and safety concerns, painting me as a reckless outsider endangering families with my violent activities. She described the woods as our beloved Green Valley Nature Preserve, conveniently ignoring the fact that the HOA had no legal claim to the land. When she finally turned her attention to me, the room fell silent. Her eyes locked on mine as she asked, "Would you care to explain yourself to the community?" That was my cue. Calmly, I stood and laid out my evidence. The land was private. I had written permission. The HOA bylaws didn't apply. I placed copies of everything on the table for the board to review. For a moment, the room shifted. Richard Cooper actually leaned forward, scanning the papers with a furrowed brow. Even some residents whispered among themselves, realizing Evelyn's claims didn't add up. But Evelyn wasn't about to lose control. She cut me off, declaring that the HOA's long-standing use of the trails gave them rights. She spoke of community stewardship, an established precedent, throwing around legal jargon meant to intimidate. Marcus jumped in to echo her, warning about the danger of firearms so close to homes. One by one, her loyalists chimed in with fear-laced statements about children, safety, and property values. It was clear this wasn't a meeting. It was a performance, and I was the villain in her carefully scripted play. The only problem was, reality wasn't on her side. When Officer Mike Davis, a local cop who also lived in the neighborhood, arrived at the meeting, he reviewed my paperwork and confirmed the obvious. I was hunting legally. I had permission. There was no trespassing, no crime, and nothing for the HOA to enforce. For most people, that would have been the end of it. But Evelyn wasn't most people. She leaned forward, voice dripping with venom, and announced that regardless of legality, the HOA had the authority to uphold community standards. The fine, she declared, stood. If I didn't pay, she threatened to place a lien on my property and take me to court. I didn't flinch. I told her I wouldn't be paying a dime for something that wasn't within her jurisdiction. The room buzzed with whispers, some supportive, most fearful. Evelyn smiled that tight, artificial smile of hers, confident she'd rattled me. She had no idea I was already planning my counterstrike. As I left the meeting, I spotted a glossy brochure on the table by the door. Green Valley Trails. It read in bold letters. Inside, I saw a map, and my jaw tightened. The entire 80 acres of Frank Williams' land was marked as if it belonged to the HOA. Trails, benches, even a future Evelyn Richardson Nature Park. They had marketed and fundraised for improvements on land they didn't even own. That night, I called Frank to let him know what was happening. He was shocked, telling me he'd never given anyone else permission to use his property. In fact, he confessed that rising medical bills had him considering selling the land altogether. That's when an idea struck me. I had the means, I had the motive, and if I played my cards right, I could end Evelyn's little empire once and for all. So I made him an offer. And as the pieces began to fall into place, I realized I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was about to take the fight directly to the heart of the HOA, and what I uncovered next, that changed everything. Before we jump in, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe, because this HOA showdown is only heating up, and what happens next will leave you speechless. The night I called Frank Williams and learned he was willing to sell, the entire situation shifted. What had started as Evelyn slapping me with a bogus fine now became something much bigger. Suddenly, I had the opportunity not just to defend myself, but to take control of the very land Evelyn and her HOA had been abusing for years. Frank named his price, $750,000. It wasn't pocket change, and it would drain a large portion of my savings, along with some inheritance my grandparents had left me. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. This wasn't just about land. It was about leverage. It was about ending Evelyn's reign of intimidation once and for all. While I quietly worked with my attorney, Amanda Lewis, to prepare the purchase, Evelyn doubled down on her attacks. In the span of a week, I received 3 new violations from the HOA, one for leaving my garbage bins out of alignment, one for unauthorized vehicle storage, even though it was my own truck, parked in my own driveway, and, of course, a late fee tacked on to the original hunting fine. Each notice went into a folder. I didn't argue, didn't respond. Amanda had told me, document everything, stay quiet, and let the paperwork speak when the time came. Meanwhile, my neighbor Sarah kept me informed about what was happening behind closed doors. Evelyn was hosting private meetings with her inner circle, whispering about a big announcement. She was cozying up to Daniel Thompson, a city councilman known for pushing through development projects. And more troubling, her husband Trevor, an architectural consultant, had been spotted surveying Frank's land with measuring equipment. The pieces were falling into place. Evelyn wasn't just maintaining trails. She was preparing to build something bigger. Sure enough, when I dug into county records, I found it. Preliminary applications filed by the HOA to develop a full-blown community park, walking paths, picnic areas, even a stone entrance sign labeled Evelyn Richardson Nature Park. The audacity was staggering. They didn't own the land. They never asked the owner. And yet here they were, funneling money into grant applications and architectural renderings for a project that wasn't even theirs to build. That's when the real cracks started to show. A few nights later, I got an unexpected knock at the door. An older man introduced himself as Robert Jackson, a retired accountant and a former board member. Nervous, he told me he had to get something off his chest. Years ago, when the board first learned the land wasn't HOA property, Evelyn had told them to forget about it. She claimed adverse possession would take care of it eventually, that, after enough years of use, the HOA could claim it as their own. Robert disagreed, resigned, and kept quiet. But now, seeing how far Evelyn had gone, he couldn't stay silent. He warned me there were also financial irregularities. That trail funds raised from homeowners never added up in the official reports. It was more than just arrogance. It was fraud. By then, Amanda had expedited the land purchase. Within a week, I held the deed in my hand. 80 acres of woodland, legally mine. Evelyn's so-called community trails weren't hers anymore. They were mine. And the moment she came knocking with her legal threats, I'd be ready. Sure enough, the next morning, she showed up on my porch with Marcus at her side. She was dressed like she was headed into court, portfolio in hand, ready to intimidate. Marcus hovered behind her, silent but stern. Evelyn started her speech about lawsuits and liens, warning me that the HOA would drag me into court if I didn't pay. That's when I slid the folder across the coffee table. The deed, the survey map, proof that the land she'd claimed as her pride and joy was now legally mine. The look on her face was priceless. Shock, then denial, then anger. Marcus turned pale as he realized the implications. Everything they'd planned, the park, The fundraising, the glossy renderings, was dead in the water. Worse, it was all built on a lie. I laid it out plainly. The trails, the benches, the feeders, all unauthorized. They had 7 days to remove their installations. And their fraudulent park project, it was done. Amanda had already drafted a cease and desist letter, demanding all fundraising stop immediately. Evelyn tried to argue, tried to twist her way out, but the ground beneath her feet was crumbling. For the first time, she wasn't in control, and she hated it. But I knew Evelyn wasn't finished. She wouldn't just accept defeat. She would fight, claw, and scheme to keep her power, and she still had allies in the neighborhood willing to believe her story. That evening, Sarah texted me in all caps, "Emergency HOA, meeting tonight. Evelyn is furious. Everyone's talking about you buying the land." I showed up prepared, with every piece of evidence I had. The room was packed tighter than ever, residents buzzing with rumors. Evelyn stood at the front, Trevor by her side with his glossy park renderings, Marcus nodding along like a bob. She painted me as a selfish outsider, accusing me of stealing the trails the community had cherished for years. But the moment I spoke, the narrative shifted. Calmly, I explained the truth. The land had always been private. The HOA had no right to use it, let alone raise money for it. And now, every dollar collected under the guise of a park project was tied to false claims. Residents demanded answers. Where had their money gone? Why hadn't the board disclosed the truth? The room fractured. Some shouted at me, calling me the villain. Others turned on Evelyn, demanding transparency. For the first time, her authority wavered. But then, something happened that changed the game entirely. As the shouting reached a peak, a woman named Nancy Roberts, the HOA secretary, stood up. Her face was pale, her hands trembling, but her words were steady. She accused Evelyn of funneling tens of thousands of dollars from the park fund into a company called Green Vision Consulting, a company owned by Trevor Adams, Evelyn's husband. The room went silent. The air was electric. And in that silence, everyone realized this wasn't just an HOA power struggle anymore. This was corruption. And with that revelation, Evelyn's empire began to collapse. Before we get into the next part, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. You won't believe how fast this HOA president's empire started to crumble once the truth came out. The night Nancy Roberts spoke up changed everything. Her voice shook, but her words hit like a hammer. She revealed that Green Vision, Consulting, the company pocketing the park development, money, was owned by Evelyn's husband Trevor and Marcus Bennett's sister, Patricia. Suddenly, the glossy renderings, the surveys, the inflated invoices, they all took on a different meaning. This wasn't about building a park. It was about funneling homeowners' money straight into the pockets of Evelyn's inner circle. The room erupted in chaos. Residents who had once clapped politely at Evelyn's speeches were now shouting over one another. Some demanded an audit. Others demanded refunds. Evelyn tried to keep control, slamming her hand on the table and declaring everything above board. But the panic in her eyes told the truth. I walked out of that meeting with more than just vindication. I walked out with allies. People who had once avoided me now approached in hushed voices, offering support, whispering that they'd suspected something was wrong for years. The illusion of Evelyn's untouchable power had cracked, and once a crack appears, it only spreads. The next morning, I met Nancy in secret at a coffee shop 2 towns over. She was nervous, glancing around as if Evelyn herself might walk in. From her purse, she slid me a flash drive. On it, years of financial records, payment authorizations, and emails. She explained how Evelyn bypassed normal board approvals, fast-tracking payments to Green Vision Consulting under the guise of specialized services. No competitive bidding, no oversight, just rubber-stamped invoices. Amanda, my attorney, combed through the data and confirmed what we both suspected. This wasn't sloppy bookkeeping. This was embezzlement. Plain and simple. We didn't sit on it. Amanda contacted Detective Alex Morgan, a financial crimes investigator with the county sheriff's office. When he saw the files, he agreed there were grounds to open a case. "This goes beyond HOA politics," he said flatly. "If they raised money for a park on land they didn't own, and then funneled it to family businesses, that's fraud." Meanwhile, Evelyn wasn't sitting idle. If she couldn't silence me with fines, she would try to bury me in public shame. Anonymous notes appeared on my windshield calling me a murderer, and TIFF protesters, clearly organized by Evelyn, showed up on my lawn with signs reading "Save Our Trails" and "Community over Selfishness." Local Facebook groups were flooded with posts, painting me as a dangerous outsider, destroying everything Green Valley stood for. But the harder she pushed, the more desperate she looked. The Valley Chronicle published an article by Emily Chen, the reporter who had visited me earlier. She laid out the facts. The land was private, the HOA had no legal claim, and residents had raised tens of thousands for a park project under questionable circumstances. It wasn't a hit piece. It was balanced, but it raised the one question Evelyn couldn't answer. Where had the money gone? The day after the article, Evelyn's lawyer sent me a cease and desist letter. They threatened to sue me for defamation, demanding $100,000 in damages for reputational harm. Amanda read it and laughed. "This is desperation," she said. "They're trying to scare you into silence before the investigation lands." By then, though, the tide was turning. Longtime residents who had once feared Evelyn's wrath began speaking out. John Peterson, a retired banker, admitted he'd donated $5,000 to the park fund, and he wanted answers. Cynthia Miller, a former board member, called for a full financial audit. Even Richard Cooper, the treasurer, who had always looked uneasy, began distancing himself from Evelyn. At the next HOA meeting, Evelyn tried to regain control. She launched into a fiery speech about baseless attacks and outsiders spreading lies. But this time, the room wasn't with her. Whispers spread, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. When Richard finally broke ranks and admitted Evelyn had pressured him into approving payments without oversight, the dam burst. That's when it happened. Detective Morgan and the district attorney himself, William Hayes, walked into the room. They didn't say much. They didn't have to. Their presence alone was enough to send Evelyn spiraling. She shouted about loyalty, about betrayal, about everything she had sacrificed for the community. But the words rang hollow. For the first time, people weren't afraid to stand up to her. Nancy rose to her feet and told the truth. Trembling but defiant, she revealed how Evelyn threatened her job at the school district if she asked too many questions. She admitted she'd kept copies of documents for years out of fear something like this would happen. And when she slid a thick folder across the table to the DA, Evelyn's composure shattered. "This is slander," Evelyn screamed. "This is all lies." But no one believed her anymore. By the end of that night, Evelyn was no longer the queen of Green Valley Estates. She was a cornered ruler whose empire was crumbling around her. But even then, she wasn't finished. 2 days later, word spread of her final desperate move. She announced a trail preservation walk, urging residents to show up Saturday morning and march onto my land in defiance of my new ownership. "Reclaim our trails," the flyer read. "Show this outsider he can't steal what's ours." It was a mass trespass, carefully staged to paint me as the villain, one man blocking families from their beloved woods, and Evelyn planned to lead it herself. What she didn't know was that I was ready. Before we dive in, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe. Because what you're about to hear is Evelyn Richardson's most desperate stunt yet. And trust me, it does not end the way she planned. Evelyn's trail preservation walk wasn't about trails. It wasn't about community. It was about saving face. After years of controlling Green Valley Estates like her personal kingdom, she was losing her grip. The fraud investigation was closing in. Residents were asking questions she couldn't answer, and her once loyal allies were jumping ship. So she did the only thing left to her. She staged a spectacle, a march of families, children, and neighbors, straight onto my newly purchased land. Her goal was simple: paint me as the villain. She wanted photos of parents with strollers, stopped at a fence, kids crying because their trails were closed, and herself standing tall as the heroic defender of community rights. But she underestimated me. In the days leading up to the so-called walk, I filed every piece of paperwork I could. With Amanda's help, I officially designated my land as a private wildlife reserve. It gave me additional protections, tax benefits, and more importantly, legal standing. I installed sturdy fencing and bold signs. Private property, no trespassing, wildlife conservation area. I even added an entry gate with a kiosk explaining the conservation status, complete with county permits displayed. Evelyn wanted a villain. I was going to be the law-abiding property owner standing in her way, with the sheriff's office watching. Saturday morning came crisp and cool. I stood at the gate with Amanda at my side, a camera ready to record. Sure enough, at 9 sharp, Evelyn appeared at the head of a crowd of 30 people. She wore brand new hiking gear, sunglasses perched on her head, and carried a walking stick she'd probably never used before in her life. Behind her, signs waved in the air. "Save our trails. Community over greed. Stop the outsider." She stopped at the gate, turned dramatically to her crowd, and shouted about rights, heritage, and betrayal. Cameras flashed. Phones recorded. She was staging her grand performance. Then she reached for the gate. That's when 3 patrol cars pulled up. Deputies stepped out, led by Detective Morgan himself. Calmly, he announced that the land was private, legally purchased, and that any trespassing would result in arrest. He looked Evelyn square in the eyes. Organizing a mass entry like this could be considered further evidence in your case. For a moment, Evelyn froze. Her face flushed red, but she forced a smile, turning to her followers. This is intimidation. They can't stop us. Marcus, tell them, she barked. But Marcus wasn't there to save her. He stepped back, avoiding eye contact, clearly unwilling to risk arrest for her crusade. One by one, her followers backed away. Parents pulled their kids close. Signs lowered. The crowd that had marched so confidently began to trickle back to their cars. "You're all cowards," Evelyn shouted after them. "After everything I've done for you." Her words, once commands that carried weight, now sounded hollow. She was no longer a leader. She was a desperate woman unraveling in public, as the last of her supporters left. Evelyn glared at me through the fence. "This isn't over," she hissed, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. But even she must have known her words had lost their power. What followed in the next week was a flood of revelations. The sheriff's office executed search warrants, including on the storage unit, where Trevor and Patricia tried to quietly move boxes of financial records. Those records told the whole story. Inflated invoices, fake expenses, and vacations disguised as consulting trips. More than $68,000 siphoned from the community over 3 years. The DA filed charges: fraud, embezzlement, and misuse of HOA funds. Evelyn, Trevor, and Patricia were all named. Marcus, though not directly implicated in the finances, became toxic by association. His political connections couldn't shield him from the scandal. The HOA board collapsed overnight. An emergency vote stripped Evelyn of her presidency. For the first time in years, residents felt free to speak openly, without fear of retaliation. Sarah Johnson was nominated interim president. Her first act was to call for a full audit of HOA funds and implement new transparency measures. But for Evelyn, the nightmare was only beginning. The news spread fast. Emily Chen's follow-up article laid everything bare, from the fraudulent park plans to the family-owned consulting scheme. Photos of Evelyn screaming at her failed march circulated online, turning her from a feared leader into a local joke. Yet, even as her empire fell apart, Evelyn wasn't done scheming. At the next community meeting, which she wasn't even supposed to attend, she barged in uninvited. Disheveled, furious, she ranted about conspiracies, about how I had manipulated the system, about how the DA was biased. She promised revenge, vowing that I'd regret ever moving into Green Valley. Her threats might have seemed pathetic, if not for the fact that she still had influence, still had connections, still had the ability to cause damage on her way down. And I had a feeling she wasn't going to surrender. Quietly, because when someone like Evelyn loses everything, they don't just fade away. They fight. They claw. They burned everything around them. And she was about to make her final, desperate move. Before we get into the conclusion, don't forget to like this video and subscribe, because this is the part where the HOA president, who thought she owned everything, finally learns what happens when the law comes knocking. After Evelyn's humiliating failed march onto my land, her empire was in freefall. Charges had been filed. Her allies were abandoning her, and the community she once ruled with an iron fist was turning against her. But if you thought she would go quietly, you don't know Evelyn Richardson. 2 days after the charges hit the news, Evelyn launched her final stunt. Through emails, flyers, and social media posts, she called for a community uprising against corruption, painting herself as the victim of a smear campaign led by me, the outsider. She tried to rally residents one last time, promising that if they stood with her, she'd restore their trails, refund their money, and protect their homes from greedy developers. But the magic was gone. Fewer than 10 people showed up to her so-called rally. The rest of the neighborhood watched from their porches, shaking their heads. Evelyn's power had evaporated, and all that remained was her anger. Meanwhile, the investigation gained momentum. The files pulled from Trevor and Patricia's storage unit told a damning story. Inflated invoices for consulting work, HOA checks cashed into personal accounts, thousands spent on vacations labeled as planning trips. The trail of fraud was undeniable. The DA's office announced formal charges: wire fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, and misuse of non-profit funds. Evelyn, Trevor, and Patricia were all indicted. Facing the evidence, they had no choice but to accept plea deals. Each admitted guilt, received probation, suspended jail sentences, and were ordered to repay over $100,000. But the punishment that stung the most wasn't legal. It was personal. As part of the deal, they were barred from managing any non-profit or HOA for the next 10 years. Evelyn, the self-proclaimed queen of Green Valley, was permanently stripped of the crown she'd worn for so long. Within a month, they sold their house and left quietly. No farewell parties, no waves from neighbors, just a moving truck pulling out at dawn, and silence where there had once been endless orders and threats. Evelyn had become exactly what she always despised: irrelevant. For the rest of us, Green Valley Estates changed overnight. Under Sarah Johnson's leadership as interim president, the HOA transformed from a tool of control into a genuine community organization. Meetings shifted from tense interrogations to collaborative discussions. The first major vote was a unanimous decision to conduct a full financial audit, with results shared publicly. Residents who had once been divided by fear started to trust one another again. As for the land, I kept my word. With proper permits, insurance, and careful planning, I opened a small section of the property as a legitimate public trail. I named it the Frank Williams Memorial Trail, in honor of the man who had owned it for decades. A plaque at the trailhead told Frank's story and served as a reminder of what happens when communities forget to respect boundaries, both literal and legal. The rest of the land I left as conservation space, a quiet refuge where wildlife thrived, and I could continue my hunting tradition with full support from my neighbors. For the first time since moving in, I felt at peace, not because the HOA was gone, but because it had finally become what it was supposed to be: a service, not a weapon. The money recovered from Evelyn's scheme was repurposed into something meaningful. At my suggestion, $75,000 of it was turned into a scholarship fund for students pursuing studies in ethics and leadership. A fitting legacy born from Evelyn's greed, a reminder that sometimes, even corruption can be turned into something good. As for Evelyn, the last I heard, she was living in a small apartment complex with no HOA at all. No power, no titles, no one to boss around, just another name in the background, forgotten by the very people she once ruled over. Looking back, I realize I didn't just win a fight with an HOA president. I helped expose how fragile false power really is. Evelyn built her empire on fear, lies, and manipulation. But the moment the truth came to light, it all came crashing down. And for me, the best part wasn't revenge, or even victory. It was finally having a community that lived up to its name. So if you ever find yourself facing a Karen with too much power, remember this: rules are one thing, but property law, that's a whole different battlefield. And sometimes, the best way to win is to shine a light so bright that their shadows disappear. That's how one bogus $5,000 fine turned into the end of an HOA president's reign. Still thinking about what just happened? Yeah, us too. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stick around, because we've got plenty more HOA drama stories coming your way.